A smiling woman with a coffee cup and remote addresses a crowded room.
Oh, wow. This has gone by quickly. For you, yeah? Good, okay. Bringing together a couple of observations, and I learned a ton today. I'm always learning. And one of the things that I'm always present to when we talk about inclusion is there's so many ways to consider different facets of human diversity, different facets of the technologies that we're making. It can feel like, man, I can think about 100 things every day and still never make it all the way through all of these considerations. And so one thing I wanted to share is that one thing for me that's become really clear about inclusion, and back to Leah's point about what does it mean for us individually, for me it's an imperfect thing. There is no perfect state that we are achieving. It is about this continuous cycle of improvement. And it's like brushing teeth. I think it was like I wake up in the morning, and even if I brushed them really, really well yesterday, I still got to do it again today. And it's just that life, that choice of that way of being and working and interacting with the world around us, that is a manifestation of inclusion. And so, with that in mind, I think I wanted to bridge a little bit off of, we've talked a lot about different outcomes and products and methods and communities. I want to bridge a bit from where Vanessa and Anna and Leah kind of brought us, the conversation about who's participating in the process. And just sharing this cycle, again, trying to break up the fixed circle and think about it as this continual cycle of choices. I just want to share a couple of quick examples inside of each of these points of the cycle. So again, this cycle has, who's making a solution. We talked a little bit about that today. Who's on those teams? What we make, what do we actually think is the solution we're putting out in the world? Why we make it, and the cultural choices and the purpose, what inclusion means to us. Who uses it, our assumptions about people and their abilities and the way that they interact in the world, and then how it's made and the tools that we develop. And as I talk about this, I wanted to maybe bring it one kind of layer up, because we've taken a really strong, one of the best I've seen in a long time, deep dives into specific accessibility considerations, specific technologies for assistive tech. So I want to pop it up a little bit, and as we think about inclusion through other lenses of human diversity. And because one of the things that I found in this conversation is a lot of people were approaching me with questions about inclusion by race and gender and language and multiple facets. And is there an underlying thread that there's a shared practice in all this? And I do believe there is. And I'll share a little bit through these examples on what I think that looks like. So coming back to what we make and who uses it. Here's an example from John Porter, who is also a PhD student in the HCDE program and a designer at Microsoft. And John he's also a contributor to the book Mismatch, and he wanted to be here today, but he couldn't. He has a board in his room, his bedroom. It's painted black. It's like a big pegboard. You ever seen those where you hang tools up on it? Instead of tools, he's hung up every video game console controller since the beginning of the industry. Right? And he calls it his wall of exclusion. Because if you look at all these devices, they've all required two hands to play since the beginning of the industry. And John doesn't have two hands to play. He uses primarily speech commanding and a lot of different techniques to code his own types of buttons and interfaces that he uses to do some pretty advanced gaming. And so his point was, when I look at these devices, it sends a really clear signal who gaming is for and who it's not for, right? But the gaming world is so vast and diverse. There's a lot going on in there. And to think that it's gated by this simple design bias is really contradictory to the real purpose of gaming. And so he's, as I mentioned, a designer at Microsoft. And one of the ways that Microsoft has developed the Xbox Adaptive Controller is working very closely with Warfighter Engaged and Able Gamers and a community of disabled gamers who have shared their own techniques and methods of creating these diverse interfaces and customized rigs so that the way that they play in the different types of interfaces that they prefer to use all can work inside of this one device and map to any single game. But it's bringing that expertise into the design process that led Microsoft to this point. And so, there's a product, and it's beautiful. It is transformative. Everything to the packaging is designed with consideration of the input and the contributions from this disabled gaming community that they worked with. But it's how they got there that I wanted to really underscore, and who participated in the process that makes this product special. Another example, and who makes the solutions in our world. So this is a good friend of mine, Tiffany Brown, who's also a contributor to the book. When I first met Tiffany, I will never forget what she told me. She said that in the history of licensed architecture, only 400 architects had been female and African American. So that's 0.3% in the United States. And it matters because these positions of leadership and professional decision-making are gated by certain criteria and they influence and impact the shape of the world around us. And so here's a picture of Tiffany in front of the housing project that she grew up in, or what was the housing project she grew up in Detroit, Michigan, Herman Gardens, and it was razed to the ground when she was 15. And with the promise of economic development that never manifested. And here she is many, many years later, where that experience inspired her to study architecture, to become an architectural designer, and to really understand how those decisions shape the world around her. And Detroit's an important place to consider this conversation because the history there is pretty deep. So on the left-hand side here is an image of the first public housing projects in Detroit, in a black and white image, the Brewster Douglas housing projects. And the entire neighborhoods were torn down, primarily African American and black neighborhoods torn down to make room for this development. And Detroit has a history of tearing down and rebuilding neighborhoods, predominantly working class and low-income African American neighborhoods. And this has reshaped the racial distribution of Detroit. This practice happens in many cities in the United States, but reshaped the racial distribution of Detroit, which is the image on the right, which shows a lot of blue dots and red dots in the shape of this metropolitan Detroit area. The blue dots denote the African American population of Detroit, and also, coincidentally, the boundaries of the metropolitan area. And the red dots around that kind of central area denote the Caucasian white American population in Detroit. And the boundaries between these hard lines are literally streetways, waterways, physical structures that have been constructed and have in essence become a shut-in, shut-out barrier in the city itself. And so in the engagement of how do we impact, who makes these decisions on where these lines are drawn, which neighborhoods are torn down and rebuilt, one of the ways that Brown has been leading this is through an organization called 400 Forward, which is committed to empowering and supporting the next 400 female African-American architects through education and mentorship. And this is her working with students in the Detroit area, but also in her own work as an architect at Smith Group. And this is the housing development just outside of that empty field of Herman Gardens, and a picture from her grandmother's front porch. And in that design process, she regathered the community that she'd grown up with, had conversations about what was important in that space and place, and made that a core part of the design process in the development of this neighborhood. So again, who's participating in the process and designing with that community? Two more quick examples. How we make. This is an image of Wanda Diaz Merced, who's a Puerto Rican astronomer, or astronomer who grew up in Puerto Rico. She's on the stage giving a TED Talk, and I highly recommend checking out that talk here. Diaz Merced was losing her vision through university as she was studying to become an astronomer, which is a very, very big deal because if you're an astronomer, you're primarily analyzing data visually, which there's a graph on the bottom here kind of showing some of the kind of radiation and data that Diaz Merced would collect from the cosmos. So if you can't analyze the data visually, you literally can't participate in the profession. So Diaz Merced worked to apply sonification to this data using instruments of different kinds and tones at different levels to, in essence, turn that data into a star song of some kind. And these really fascinating ways of analyzing data auditorially. And what's, I think, incredibly interesting about that is that for a community of astronomers who want to use in combination a visual and an auditory way of processing, different kinds of analysis are possible, analyses. So the tools that we make, I know some people have mentioned, as designers, so many kind of design sprint methodologies depend heavily on a paper or Post-its or physical environments that are highly visual. The tools we use are highly visual, and that absolutely shapes who can or cannot participate in the profession. But by shaping those tools and reshaping them, we also would shift who can and cannot participate as a designer. It would profoundly shift the shape of the profession. And my last point here is why we make. Last point on the cycle, these are all interrelated. This is an image of Morgan's Inspiration Island, which is in San Antonio, Texas. And this is one of my favorite examples of inclusive design. So Morgan Hartman and her parents, Maggie and Gordon, had a hard time finding places for Morgan to play when she was a child. She had a combination of she has a combination of sensory and physical disabilities. And especially in the heat of the summer, having somewhere in a water park to play was really hard to come across. They engaged a huge, diverse community of families, children with disabilities, playground professionals, engineers, and thought about all the different kinds of considerations that would go into a truly inclusive park. And so there's a couple of features here I like to point out. One is that there's a water feature here that's spraying over two children. One of the children is sitting in a wheelchair. The water can be adjusted, the temperature in real time for children with sensory needs. So it can be adjusted to the temperature they need. And also the wheelchair here is the new chair, which is PNEU, which is powered by compressed air. So it literally can go anywhere in the park as opposed to a battery-powered chair, which would not do well. Electricity and water don't mix. So what I really love about this example is way, way more than access. This is way, way more than a wheelchair accessible playground. You can see the features, the color, there's palm tree looking features. This is about a space where anyone can come and explore with a sense of adventure. They can make new friends independently, and they can go anywhere in that space. That's what the space supports. And to me, that's my favorite definition of inclusion in design, is that it's a diversity of ways to participate in an experience so that everybody has a shared sense of belonging in that space. It's about contribution and how we contribute to one another and the friendships that we make. And that the features of our world around us that we design enable or create mismatches or resolve mismatches and how people can do that. And so with that in mind, just the core piece, if there was one thing to draw from all the conversations today, all the pieces, the one kind of like starting point is that making a shift in any of these areas really starts with the participation of people who've experienced mismatches, making that a part of our design process. And I've used the term exclusion experts because I believe broadly there's many different kinds of exclusion that people face. There's cognitive, learning, physical, by many different social and emotional dimensions. But understanding what solution we're trying to make and then who experiences a mismatch is a starting point for really making an entry point into any of this. And so with that, I would leave you with a couple of questions to transition us into our Q&A. These are the simplest questions to kind of get any team going of like, thinking about a solution, who faces the greatest degree of exclusion in using those solutions today? Seek them out, invite them into the process, reshape your process so that it's centered around these people who've experienced exclusion. Who might have the most to lose? When we think about tearing down neighborhoods or adding a sensor in the back of a toilet, who has the most to lose in that quote unquote innovation that we're pursuing? And lastly, whose voice is missing? As we think about feedback and how we gather it, if we only gather it in online tools, the only people that are going to show up are people who have those online tools and interact them. So who are you hearing and who are you not hearing? Who are you engaging with, who are you not engaging with? Because the shape of the tools you're using to collect that feedback might be, again, like the swings. The only people who show up are the people who match that design. And with that, I want to thank you. And I also just want to invite the other speakers, whoever would like to come up. And we will take some Q&A for about 15 minutes, and then we'll fully wrap.